The first thing I noticed wasn't the pain, though God knows there was plenty of that, but the smell. That sharp, antiseptic scent that can only mean one thing. Hospital. My eyelids felt heavy, like someone had sewn weights into them, and when I finally managed to pry them open, fluorescent lights stabbed at my vision like angry needles. Where was I? The question floated through my mind like a leaf on water, distant and somehow unimportant. Everything felt muffled, wrapped in cotton. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Fire shot through my right hip, so intense it made me cry. Out a sound that came from somewhere deep in my chest, animal and raw. Double quotes, Mrs. Matthews. Oh, thank goodness, you're awake. A voice, warm and concerned, seemed to come from everywhere at once. I turned my head carefully this time and saw a young woman in scrubs approaching my bed. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile that reminded me of someone, though I couldn't place who. Where. My voice came out as a croak. My throat felt like sandpaper. You're at St. Mary's Hospital, she said, checking something on a chart. I'm Rebecca, your day nurse. You were brought in 2 nights ago after a fall at home. Do you remember what happened? 2 nights ago? The fog in my mind began to clear, and with it came fragments of memory. I'd been in my kitchen, reaching for the good china on the top Shara's grandmother's set that I only used for special occasions. I'd been planning to have her over for dinner, to try once more to bridge the growing distance between us. The step stool had wobbled, and then I fell, I whispered, more to myself than to Rebecca. You broke your hip, Mrs. Matthews. You had surgery yesterday morning. The doctor will be in to see you later, but the procedure went very well. You're going to be fine. Fine. The word felt foreign in my mouth. I didn't feel fine. I felt broken, and not just from the fall. As consciousness fully returned, so did the crushing weight of my reality. I was 72 years old, lying in a hospital bed, and I was completely alone. Has anyone. Did anyone come to see me? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Rebecca's smile faltered slightly. She glanced at her chart, then back at me. Well, we did contact your emergency contact. Your daughter, Sarah? My heart lifted. For the first time since waking up. Is she here? Is she outside? The pause that followed was longer than it should have been. Rebecca pulled a chair closer to my bed and sat down, never a good sign when medical staff sit down. Mrs. Matthews, we've called Sarah several times. The first time, right after you were admitted, she said she was out of town and couldn't make it immediately. We called again before your surgery, and after. Each time she said she was busy with work commitments. The words hit me like physical blows. Busy? But I had surgery. I've been alone for 2 days. I'm so sorry, Rebecca said softly. We asked if there was anyone else we could call, but you only had her listed. When we spoke to her this morning, she said she would figure something out later. Figure something out later. As if I were a scheduling conflict, a minor inconvenience to be dealt with when she had a free moment. I felt something crack inside my chest, not physical this time, but emotional. A fissure that had been growing for years finally split wide open. She's not coming, I said. Not really a question. Rebecca's silence was answer enough. I closed my eyes, trying to process this new reality. Sarah, my only child, my daughter whom I'd raised alone after her father walked out. Sarah, for whom I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for dance lessons and college tuition. Sarah, who only called when she needed money, but always ended those conversations with "love you, Mum," in a voice so sweet, I could almost believe things were normal between us. She wasn't coming. The machine monitoring my heart rate began beeping. Faster. Rebecca noticed and placed a gentle hand on my arm. Mrs. Matthews, I need you to try to stay calm. Your blood pressure is elevated, which isn't good for your healing. Calm? How could I be calm when I was facing the truth I've been avoiding for years? My daughter didn't care about me, not really. I was useful when she needed something, but when I needed her, truly needed her, she couldn't be bothered. What am I supposed to do? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. I can't drive. I can't even walk to the bathroom alone. How am I supposed to get home? How am I supposed to manage? Rebecca squeezed my hand. We have social workers who can help arrange things. There are services available, services. The word tasted bitter. Strangers pay to do what family should. Do naturally. But then again, maybe strangers would be more reliable than my own daughter. As if reading my thoughts. Rebecca continued, sometimes the people we expect to be there for us aren't available. And that's not a reflection of your worth, Mrs. Matthews. It's a reflection of their choices. I wanted to argue, to defend Sarah, to make excuses the way I always had. She was busy. She had her own life. She was still dealing with stress from her divorce last year. But lying there in that hospital bed, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life, I couldn't summon the energy to keep making excuses. Can I have some water? I asked, mostly because I needed a moment to think. Rebecca helped me sip from a straw, and the cool water felt like a blessing on my parched throat. As I drank, I noticed my purse sitting on the bedside table. Inside was my whole life wallet, keys, reading glasses, and somewhere in the bottom, business cards from various appointments and consultations. One part in particular came to mind. Marcus Chun, the elder law attorney I'd consulted a few months ago about updating my will. I'd been worried about making sure everything was in order for Sarah. Ironically enough, he'd been kind, patient, and most importantly, he'd actually listened. To me. Rebecca, I said, my voice stronger now. I need to make a phone call. Something had shifted in me during those few minutes of silence. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but underneath it, I felt something else stirring. Something that felt almost like determination. If Sarah couldn't be bothered to show up when I needed her most, then maybe it was time to stop waiting for her to become the daughter I'd always hoped she'd be. Maybe it was time to start protecting myself. I was going to call Marcus Chen, and I was going to ask him to be my emergency contact, but it was time to stop depending on someone who had made it clear I wasn't a priority in her life. It was time to start making some changes of my own. Rebecca had wheeled the hospital phone to my bedside, its long cord snaking across the linoleum floor, like a lifeline I wasn't sure I wanted to grab. My fingers trembled as I dialed Sarah's number, the same number I'd memorized 20 years ago when she got her first apartment. Back then, she'd call me every Sunday without fail. Now, I was lucky if I heard from her once a month. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. With each ring, my heart hammered against my ribs. Part of me hoped she wouldn't answer. It would be easier to believe she was genuinely unreachable than to face another conversation where I felt like a burden. Hello? Her voice was sharp, impatient. In the background, I could hear the television and what sounded like her kids arguing about something. Sarah, it's Mom. The words came out smaller than I intended. A pause. Then, look, I'm really busy right now. Can this wait? Can this wait? I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to walk, facing the terrifying prospect of going home alone to an apartment I could barely manage, even when I was healthy. Could it wait? Sarah, I'm still in the hospital. I know the nurses called you, but I wanted to talk to you myself. I had surgery and I'm scared and I really need Mom. The word cut through my rambling like a blade. I told the hospital people I can't just drop everything. I have a job, I have kids, I have responsibilities. I understand that, sweetheart. But I'm your mother. I broke my hip. I had to have surgery. I can't drive, I can't cook for myself. I can't even get up the stairs to my apartment without help. I just need. You just need. You just need. Sarah's voice rose, and I heard a door slam in the background. She'd moved to another room. Probably. So the kids wouldn't hear her yelling at their grandmother. Do you know what I need, Mom? I need my boss to stop breathing down my neck about this project. I need my ex-husband to actually pay child support on time. I need my son to stop getting in trouble at school. I need a lot of things, but apparently, my needs don't matter as much as yours. The cruelty in her tone hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't the daughter I'd raised, the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and whisper that she loved me more than the whole world. This was a stranger wearing Sarah's voice, and she was angry at me for existing. Sarah, please, I'm not asking you to solve all my problems. I just need help getting home from the hospital. Maybe you could stay with me for a few days while I figure out how to manage. I know it's inconvenient, but... Inconvenient. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mum, my entire life has been inconvenient because of you. Do you have any idea what it was like growing up with a mother who worked all the time? Do you know how embarrassing it was to have friends ask why my dad never came to anything? And now, when I'm finally trying to build my own life, you want me to drop everything and play nursemaid? I felt like I'd been slapped. Sarah, I worked. All the time because I had to. Your father left us. I was doing my best to provide for you, to give you opportunities. Your best? Her voice dripped with disdain. Your best was making me feel guilty every time I needed new clothes or wanted to do activities like my friends. Your best was crying into your coffee every morning and making me feel responsible for your sadness. Your best was never having enough money for anything fun, but always finding money for your cigarettes. I hadn't smoked in 15 years, but I remembered those days. The stress, the exhaustion, the way I'd sometimes sit on the porch after Sarah. Went to bed and allow myself 1 cigarette and 5 minutes of self-pity, before going back inside to tackle the pile of bills on the kitchen table. I did quit smoking, I said weakly. I did my best with what I had. Well, your best wasn't good enough. The words hung in the air between us like poison gas. And now you want me to sacrifice my life to take care of you the way you never took care of me. I did take care of you. The words burst out of me with such force that Rebecca looked up from her station across the room. I gave you everything I had. I worked 3 jobs to pay for your dance lessons. I took out loans for your college tuition. I emptied my savings account to help with your divorce lawyer. I've never said no when you needed help. Because you were guilty. Sarah shot back. You felt bad about Dad leaving, so you threw money at me instead of actually being a mother. And now you think that gives you the right to demand my time and attention whenever you want it. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. This wasn't how this conversation was supposed to go. I'd imagined Sarah being concerned. Maybe. Even apologetic for not coming sooner. I'd never imagined this level of venom. Sarah, I love you. You're my daughter, my only child. I'm not demanding anything. I'm asking for help because I'm scared and I'm alone and I don't know what else to do. You should have thought about that before. Before what? Before you made me your whole world. Before you made me responsible for your happiness. Before you guilt-tripped me every time I tried to have my own life. I spent my entire childhood taking care of your feelings, and I'm not doing it anymore. The line went quiet except for the sound of both of us breathing. I could hear my heart monitor beeping faster, matching the rhythm of my panic. So you're just going to leave me here? I whispered. I'm not leaving you anywhere, Mom. You're an adult. Figure it out. Her voice had gone flat, emotionless. I have to go. Emma has soccer practice. and I'm already late. Sarah, wait. I can't keep doing this, Mom. I can't keep being your emotional support person. I have my own life to live. But I'm your mother. Yeah. Well, maybe you should have been a better one. The line went dead. I stared at the phone. In my hand, the dial tone buzzing like an angry insect. Rebecca appeared at my bedside, her face full of concern. Mrs. Matthews? Are you all right? Your blood pressure is spiking. I couldn't speak. I couldn't process what had just happened. My daughter, my Sarah, had just told me I was a burden she no longer wanted to carry. She'd thrown my love back in my face like it was something dirty and unwanted. Maybe you should have been a better one. The words echoed in my mind, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. I handed the phone back to Rebecca with shaking hands. She's not coming, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry, Rebecca said, that I barely heard her. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time Sarah had called me just to talk, not because she needed something. I tried to remember the last time she'd said she loved me and meant it. I tried to remember when exactly I'd lost my daughter, but I couldn't pinpoint the moment. Maybe I'd never really had her at all. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and final. I was 72 years old, lying broken in a hospital bed, and I was completely, utterly alone. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Sarah's voice. Maybe you should have been a better one. The words played on repeat in my mind like a broken record, each repetition carving deeper grooves of pain into my heart. Rebecca had brought me extra pillows and adjusted my pain medication, but there was no pill for the kind of hurt I was feeling. The physical pain from my hip was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of realizing that my own daughter saw me as a burden. She'd finally worked up the courage to shed as dawn crept through the hospital room windows, painting everything in shades of grey. I found myself staring at my purse on the bedside table. It was the same brown leather purse I'd carried for 5 years, not because I loved it, but because I couldn't afford to replace it. Sarah had commented on it once during one of our rare dinners together, suggesting I treat myself to something nicer. Easy for her to say when she wasn't living on Social Security and a meager pension. But this morning, that old purse looked different to me. It looked like possibility. I knew what was in there. Besides the usual items: wallet, tissues, reading, glasses, a small address book filled with phone numbers of people who were mostly dead now. There was a collection of business cards rubber-banded together. Cards from doctors, the pharmacy, my insurance agent, and somewhere in that stack, a card I'd almost forgotten about. Marcus Chun, attorney at law, elder law and estate planning. I'd met him 3 months ago, back when I was still deluding myself that I needed to make sure everything was in order for Sarah. I'd been worried about my will, about making sure the little I had would go to her smoothly when I died. How pathetic that seemed now, me lying awake nights, worrying about making things easier for someone who couldn't even be bothered to visit me in the hospital. Memory of that appointment came back to me in pieces. Marcus had been younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office had been comfortable, not intimidating like I'd feared. He'd listened patiently as I explained my situation, asked thoughtful questions, and never once made me feel stupid for not understanding legal terminology. Most importantly, he treated me with respect. He'd offered me coffee, remembered my name without checking his notes, and when I'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed by all the paperwork, he'd said, "Mrs. Matthews, you're being very responsible by taking care of this now. Your daughter is lucky to have such a thoughtful mother." A thoughtful mother. When was the last time someone had described me that way? I reached for my purse, wincing as the movement sent a sharp pain through my hip. My fingers fumbled with the zipper, and I had to pause twice to catch my breath. Everything hurt, not just my body, but my soul. I felt like I'd been turned inside out, all my raw emotions exposed to the harsh fluorescent light. The business cards were held together with a rubber band that had seen better days. I flipped through them slowly. Dr. Patterson, my primary care. Physician, Miller's Pharmacy. State Farm Insurance. And then, there it was. Marcus Chun, attorney at law. The card was slightly bent from being in my purse, but his phone number was clearly visible. I stared at that card for a long time. What was I thinking? I barely knew this man. We'd met once, for less than an hour, and now I was considering asking him to be my emergency contact. It was crazy. It was desperate. It was ... It was better than having no one at all. My hands shook as I reached for the hospital phone. It was early, only 7:30 in the morning, but his card listed his direct line. Maybe he was an early riser. Maybe he'd understand. Maybe he'd think I was a pathetic old woman who had nowhere else to turn. Maybe he'd be right. Dialed the number before I could lose my nerve. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Marcus Chen, Mr. Chen, this is Eleanor Matthews. I don't know if you remember me, but I came to see you a few months ago about updating my will. Mrs. Matthews, of course I remember you. How are you? Is everything all right? The genuine concern in his voice nearly made me cry. When was the last time someone had asked how I was, and actually wanted to know the answer? I'm in the hospital, Mr. Chun. St. Mary's. I fell and broke my hip, and I paused, struggling to find the words. How do you explain to someone that your own daughter has abandoned you? How do you admit that level of failure as a mother? I'm so sorry to hear that, he said. Are you getting the care you need? Do you have family with you? A question I'd been dreading. That's actually why I'm calling. I know this is unusual, and I don't want to impose, but I don't have anyone else to ask. I took a deep breath, gathering what little courage I had left. Would you be willing to be my emergency contact? Silence. A long pause that made my heart sink. Of course he'd say no. He was a lawyer, not a social worker. He had his own life, his own responsibilities. Why would he want to get involved with Mrs. Matthews, he said gently. Can you tell me what's happened? And somehow, maybe because his voice was so kind, maybe because I had nothing left to lose, I told him everything. About Sarah not coming to the hospital, about the phone call, about the cruel things she'd said, about how alone I felt, how scared. I was about going home to an empty apartment where I could barely manage even when I was healthy. I told him about the years of giving Sarah everything I had, only to discover that she saw it as manipulation rather than love. I told him about the emptiness I felt knowing that my only child viewed me as a burden, rather than a person worth caring about. Marcus listened without interrupting, without judgment, without trying to fix things or tell me what I should do. He just listened, and somehow that simple act of being heard made me feel more human than I had in months. Mrs. Matthews, he said when I finished, I'm honored that you thought of me. Yes, I'll be your emergency contact. But more than that, I'd like to help you think through some practical matters. You shouldn't have to face this alone. I can't pay you, I said quickly. Not for this. I know your time is valuable, and Mrs. Matthews, he interrupted gently. Sometimes being a human being is more important than being a lawyer. You're not hiring me to be your emergency contact. You're asking me to be there when you need help, and I'm saying yes. I cried then. Not the quiet, dignified tears I've been holding back for days, but deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere. Primal and raw. Marcus waited patiently while I composed myself, never once making me feel embarrassed about my emotion. "When can you come home?" he asked. "The doctor said maybe tomorrow, if I can arrange for help." "Then I'll be there to pick you up. We'll figure out the rest as we go." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet hospital room feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope that Sarah would change, but real hope. Hope that there were still good people in the world. Hope that I didn't have to accept being treated poorly just because someone shared my DNA. I looked at Marcus's business card again, but this time I saw something different. I saw a lifeline. I saw the beginning of a new chapter where I didn't have to beg for basic human kindness. I was still Eleanor Matthews, still 72 years old, still recovering from a broken hip in a hospital bed. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't completely alone. And that made all the difference. Lying in that hospital bed, waiting for Marcus to arrive, I found my mind drifting backward through time. Maybe it was the pain, medication, or maybe it was my heart's desperate attempt to make sense of how I'd ended up here, abandoned by the child I'd loved more than life itself. That suddenly, I was remembering Sarah as she used to be, before the anger, before the resentment, before everything went so terribly wrong. She was 7 years old, all gangly limbs and wild curls that refused to stay in the ponytails I'd carefully crafted each morning. We were in our little apartment on Maple Street, not the tiny place I live in now, but the 2-bedroom rental with the creaky floors and the radiator that clanged like a ghost in chains. It was 1985, and we'd been on our own for 2 years since Richard left. Sarah was sitting cross-legged on my bed, her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms, waiting for our nightly ritual. I can still see her face in the lamplight. Eyes, bright with anticipation as I settled beside her with whatever book we were reading that week. That night it was Charlotte's Web. And Sarah was devastated that Charlotte was going to die. "But why, Mama?" she'd asked, using the name she'd eventually outgrow. "Why does Charlotte have to die? She's so nice." I'd smoothed her hair back from her forehead, feeling the weight of having to explain life's unfairness to someone so young. "Sometimes the people we love can't stay with us forever, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean they stop loving us. Charlotte's love for Wilbur will always be there, even after she's gone." Sarah had nodded solemnly, then snuggled closer to me. "Will you always love me, Mama? Even when I'm old and you're in heaven?" "Always and forever," I'd whispered, kissing the top of her head. Nothing could ever change that. The memory was so vivid I could almost smell her strawberry shampoo, could almost feel the warmth of her small body pressed against mine. Back then, I was her whole world, and she was mine. We were a team, Sarah and me against everything life threw at us. I remembered the morning she'd woken up with a fever, probably around 1987. She must have been 9. I'd called in sick to work, something I rarely did because I couldn't afford to lose the pay, and spent the day making her chicken soup from scratch and reading her stories. She'd been so grateful, so sweet, telling me I was the best mama in the whole world. "I'm never getting married," she declared from her nest of blankets on the couch. "I'm just going to live with you forever and ever." I'd laughed and told her she'd change her mind when she was older, but secretly, I'd hoped she was right. The idea of Sarah always being close, always being part of my life, had filled me with such joy. How naive I'd been to think love was enough to guarantee that. The birthdays came flooding back to me next. Sarah's 10th birthday, when I'd worked overtime for 3 weeks to buy her the bicycle she'd been begging for. Her face when she saw it in the living room, that morning pure, unfiltered joy. She'd hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, telling me over and over how much she loved me, how I was the best mom ever. Or her 13th birthday, when money was especially tight, because I'd had to take a pay cut at the department store. I'd made her cake from scratch, decorated it with her favorite colors, and filled our tiny living room with balloons I'd blown up myself until I was dizzy. She'd invited 3 friends over, and I'd felt so proud watching her laugh and be silly, knowing I'd managed to give her a normal teenage birthday despite our circumstances. "Mum, thank you," she'd said that night. As I tucked her in, she was getting too old for tucking in, but she still let me do it sometimes. This was the best birthday ever. I remembered helping her with homework at the kitchen table. The 2 of us bent over math problems I barely understood myself. I'd made flashcards for her spelling tests, practiced multiplication tables with her until we both had them memorized. When she struggled with reading in 4th grade, I'd read aloud with her every single night for months until she caught up. The dance lessons came later. Sarah had been 11 when she'd first expressed interest in ballet. I'd driven across town to find the most affordable classes, then worked extra shifts at the department store to pay for them. I'd sewn sequins onto her recital costumes by hand, sitting up late into the night to make sure every detail was perfect. I could still see her on that stage, pink tutu glittering under the lights, her face glowing with pride as she performed her routine. She'd found me in the audience afterward, still in her costume, and thrown her arms around my neck. "Did you see me, Mama? Did you see me dance? You were beautiful, sweetheart." Like a real ballerina. She danced until she was 15, and I'd never missed a single recital, a single rehearsal that parents were allowed to watch. Even when I was exhausted from working double shifts, even when I had to borrow gas money to drive her to the studio, I was there. Always there. High school brought new challenges, and also new joys. Sarah had joined the drama club, and I'd watched her transform into different characters on stage. She'd been brilliant in Our Town, playing Emily with such emotion that I'd cried in the audience. Afterwards, she'd found me backstage, still in her costume and stage makeup. "I want to be an actress, Mom. I want to go to college and study theatre." And I'd made it happen. Somehow, working 3 jobs, taking out student loans, emptying my savings account, I'd made it happen. Because that's what mothers do. That's what love looks like. The college years had been harder in some ways. Sarah had been so busy with classes and friends, our phone calls became shorter, less frequent. But she'd still come home for holidays, still brought me little gifts from the campus bookstore, still signed her cards. "Love, you're Sarah." I remembered her graduation day, watching her walk across that stage in her cap and gown, feeling such overwhelming pride that I thought my heart might burst. She'd worked so hard, and I'd been there supporting her every step of the way. When she'd gotten her diploma, she'd looked for me in the crowd and blown me a kiss. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," she'd said later, as we celebrated at a restaurant I couldn't really afford. "Thank you for believing in me." When had it changed? When had that sweet, loving girl become the woman who could tell me I should have been a better mother? When had my sacrifices become ammunition for her resentment instead of proof of my love? I thought about her wedding day, how beautiful she'd looked in her dress, how proud I'd been walking her down the aisle since her father wasn't there to do it. She'd held my hand during the ceremony, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "I love you." Mom. Had she meant it then? Or had the resentment already started growing, like a cancer I couldn't see? The tears came again as I lay there in that hospital bed, mourning not just the relationship I'd lost, but the daughter I'd lost. For Sarah, who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd made me Mother's Day cards with her own little hands, who'd once told me I was her hero, that Sarah was gone. Maybe she'd been gone for years, and I'd been too desperate to hold on to notice. Maybe I'd been loving a ghost, a memory of who she used to be, instead of accepting who she'd become. But God, those had been golden years. For a little while, I'd been the center of someone's universe, and she'd been the center of mine. For a little while, love had been enough. I closed my eyes and let myself remember the feel of her small hand in mine, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her smile. Whatever happened next, whatever our relationship became or didn't become, I'd had those years. I'd been loved completely, even if it didn't last, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build a new life on. The shift didn't happen overnight. If I'm being honest, it probably started years before I was willing to admit it to myself. But lying in that hospital bed, thinking about those golden years, I could pinpoint the moment when everything began to change. Sarah was 16, and I was about to make the mistake that would set the pattern for the rest of our relationship. It was the spring of 2001, and Sarah had just gotten her driver's license. For months, she'd been dropping hints about wanting a car. Not just any car, but a shiny red Honda Civic she'd seen at the dealership downtown. Her friend Jessica had gotten one for her 16th birthday. And suddenly Sarah needed one too. I can still remember the conversation that started it all. We were sitting at our kitchen table, the same one where we'd done homework together for years, and Sarah had spread out car advertisements like she was planning a military campaign. "Mom, look at this one," she'd said, pointing to a picture of that red Honda. "It's perfect, it's exactly what I want." I'd looked at the price tag and felt my stomach drop. $18,000. More than I made in 6 months at the department store. "Sweetheart, that's a lot of money. Maybe we could look at something used, something more affordable?" The change in her expression was instant. The excited smile vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. "More affordable? Mom, I'm not asking for a Mercedes. It's just a Honda. Just a Honda that cost more than my entire savings account." But I didn't say that. I was already feeling guilty for disappointing her, already scrambling for ways to make it work. "What about the blue one?" I suggested, pointing to a cheaper model. "It's still new, and it's ugly," Sarah interrupted. "And it doesn't have the features I want." "Why can't you just get me what I actually asked for?" I should have stood my ground. I should have explained that we couldn't afford it, that I was already working overtime to pay for her dance lessons and SAT prep classes. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Let me see what I can do." The next 2 weeks were a blur of phone calls to banks, credit card applications, and sleepless nights adding up numbers that never quite worked. I took on extra shifts at the store, picked up a weekend job cleaning offices, and finally, reluctantly, applied for a loan that would take me years to pay off. When I surprised Sarah with the keys to that red Honda, her reaction should have been a warning sign. Instead of the grateful tears I'd expected, she'd simply taken the keys and said, "Cool. Thanks, Mom." That was it. No hug, no, "Thank you so much." No acknowledgement of the sacrifice I'd made. Just a casual acceptance, as if expensive cars were something mothers were supposed to provide without question. But I told myself she was just being a teenager, that she'd understand when she was older. I told myself that seeing her happy was worth the financial stress, worth the extra jobs, worth the constant worry about money. I was wrong. The car opened a door I didn't know existed. Suddenly Sarah expected things. Designer clothes for school, a professional photo shoot for her senior pictures, a graduation party that cost more than my monthly rent. And each time I hesitated, each time I suggested we might need to scale back, she'd get that same cold look. "Why are you being so cheap?" she'd ask. "Other parents do this stuff for their kids." Other parents. As if I weren't already doing everything I could. As if I weren't already sacrificing my own needs for hers. The worst part was how she'd learned to manipulate my guilt. She'd gotten very good at making me feel like I was failing her. Like other mothers were somehow better because they could afford to say yes to everything. Jessica's mom bought her a whole new wardrobe for college. She'd say, not meeting my eyes. But I guess I'll just have to wear my old clothes. And I'd cave. Every time. I'd find the money somehow, take on more debt, work more hours, all to avoid seeing that disappointed look on her face. College was when things really spiraled. Sarah had gotten into a good school. But even with scholarships, the costs were staggering. Room and board, textbooks, meal plans, sorority fees, it never ended. I was working 3 jobs by then, living on coffee, and whatever was cheapest at the grocery store. But I kept finding ways to say yes. I know it's expensive, Mom, she'd say during our weekly phone calls, but everyone here is spending money. I can't be the only one who can't afford to go out with friends. So I'd send her money for restaurants, for shopping trips, for spring break vacations I could never afford myself. I'd lie awake at night wondering how I'd pay the electric bill. But I'd send Sarah another check because I couldn't bear the thought of her feeling different from her classmates. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was working myself to death trying to give her the life I'd never had. But in doing so, I was teaching her that love meant endless giving without boundaries. I was creating a monster, and I was too exhausted and too afraid to stop. Continued after graduation. Sarah's first apartment, I co-signed the lease and helped with the deposit. Her wedding, I emptied my retirement account to pay for the dress she wanted. Her divorce, I took out a loan to help with legal fees. Each time, I told myself it was temporary. Each time, I believed that this would be the last time I'd need to sacrifice so much. Each time I was wrong. But it wasn't just the money. Somewhere along the way, Sarah had learned that my love was conditional on my ability to provide for her. She'd learned that disappointment was a weapon she could use against me. That guilt was more effective than gratitude. I'd created a daughter who saw me as a resource to be mined rather than a person to be loved. And the worst part was, I'd done it with the best of intentions. I'd wanted to give her everything I never had, to make sure she never felt the financial insecurity that had haunted my own childhood. Instead, I taught her that she was entitled to everything she wanted, that my needs were less important than her desires. That love meant never saying no. The red Honda had been the first step down a path I hadn't even realized I was walking. Every time I'd chosen to sacrifice my own well-being for her happiness, I'd reinforced the idea that my value lay in what I could provide, not in who I was. Lying in that hospital bed, I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding for years. Sarah didn't hate me because I'd been a bad mother. She hated me because I'd been the wrong kind of good mother. I'd loved her so much that I'd forgotten to teach her how to love me back. I'd given her everything except the thing she needed most. Boundaries. Limits. The understanding that love is a two-way street. That relationships require reciprocity. That taking care of someone doesn't mean erasing yourself in the process. The 16-year-old girl who'd taken those car keys without a thank you had grown into a 39-year-old woman who could abandon her injured mother in a hospital bed. And I'd been the one who taught her that my needs didn't matter as much as hers. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was also, somehow, a relief. Because if I'd helped create this dynamic, maybe I could help change it. Maybe it wasn't too late to stop being a doormat and start being a person worthy of respect. Maybe it was time to learn how to say no. The pattern that began with that red Honda became the soundtrack of my adult relationship with Sarah. By the time she graduated college in 2004, I had trained her so well in the art of taking without giving that I barely recognized it was happening anymore. It had become as natural as breathing. Sarah would call when she needed something. I would find a way to provide it. And then months would pass in silence until the next crisis. The calls always started the same way. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" But I learned not to actually answer that question, because it was never really a question. It was just a pleasantry before she got to the real reason she was calling. Like in 2005, when she called me sobbing about her first apartment. She'd found a place in the trendy part of town, far more expensive than what she could afford on her entry-level marketing job salary. But she absolutely had to have it, because it was close to her office and her friends lived nearby. I need help with the security deposit, she'd said, her voice thick with tears. It's $3,000 and I don't have it. If I don't get this apartment, I'll have to live in some awful neighborhood where I won't be safe. $3,000. I was 59 years old, working at a job that barely covered my own expenses, and she was asking for $3,000 like it was pocket change. But the way she'd said it, making it about her safety. How could I say no to that? I'd taken out a cash advance on my credit card, knowing the interest would eat me alive, and driven across town to hand her the check. She'd hugged me quickly, said, "Thanks, Mom, you're the best," and then spent the next hour showing me around the apartment and talking about her exciting new life. I'd driven home feeling hollow, wondering why helping my daughter didn't feel good anymore. The apartment was just the beginning. 6 months later, it was a car repair bill she couldn't afford. Then it was designer clothes for her new job. Then it was a vacation to Mexico with friends because she was so stressed and really needed to get away. Each time I found the money. Somehow, I picked up extra shifts, delayed dental work, ate ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I care to remember. And each time, Sarah accepted my help with the casual entitlement of someone who had never learned that money doesn't grow on trees. The worst part was how she'd started to judge me for not having more. During one of our rare dinners together, in 2007, she'd looked around the chain restaurant I'd chosen and said, "Couldn't we go somewhere nicer? This place is kind of depressing." I'd wanted to tell her that this was what I could afford, that I'd been saving for weeks just to take her out to dinner. Instead, I'd smiled and said, "Sure, sweetheart. Where would you like to go?" We'd ended up at an expensive bistro where she ordered the most expensive item on the menu, while I calculated in my head whether I'd have enough money left for groceries that week. She talked about her job, her friends, her plans for redecorating, her apartment, and I'd listened and nodded and paid the check without a word about how much it cost. But the real breaking point, the moment I should have recognized what was happening, came during her wedding planning in 2009. Sarah had been dating Michael for 2 years, and when they got engaged, she'd immediately started planning what she called her dream wedding. "Mum, I've been thinking about this day since I was little," she'd said, her eyes bright with excitement. "I want everything to be perfect." Perfect, it turned out, meant expensive. Everything had to be the best, the most beautiful, the most memorable. The dress alone cost more than I made in 3 months. But when I gently suggested we might look at something more affordable, Sarah's face had crumpled. "I thought you'd want me to have the wedding of my dreams," she'd said, tears welling up. "I thought you'd be happy for me." So I'd emptied my retirement account. All of it. 20 years of careful saving, gone in an afternoon to pay for flowers and photographers, and a reception at a country club I'd never be able to afford to join. The wedding was beautiful. Sarah looked radiant, and for one shining moment, I felt like maybe it had all been worth it. When she'd walked down the aisle, when she'd smiled at me from the altar, I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made to give her this day. But during the reception, as I watched her laugh with her friends and dance with her new husband, I'd realized something that chilled me to the bone. She hadn't thanked me. Not once. Not for the dress, not for the reception, not for the $20,000 I'd spent to make her day perfect. When I'd finally worked up the courage to mention it, she'd looked at me with genuine confusion. "Thank you? Mom, you're my mother. Isn't this what mothers do? Isn't this what mothers do?" The question had haunted me for years. Their marriage lasted 3 years. When Sarah called to tell me she and Michael were getting divorced, I'd felt genuinely sad for her. Despite everything, I loved her, and I hated to see her hurting. "I'm going to need help with the lawyer," she'd said, not even pretending this was just a call to share news. "Michael's being a complete jerk about the settlement, and I need someone good to represent me. $15,000 for a divorce. Lawyer. I'd taken out a loan against my house, the same house I'd been trying to pay off for 20 years, to help her start over. And once again, the help had been accepted without gratitude, as if it were her due. The years after her divorce were perhaps the hardest. Sarah had moved back to town, but instead of bringing us closer together, her proximity had made our relationship more strained. She'd call when she was lonely, when she needed money, when she wanted someone to babysit her kids so she could go out with friends. But she never called just to see how I was doing. Never asked if I needed anything. Never seemed to notice that I was getting older, that the years of financial stress and overwork were taking their toll. By 2015, I was working part-time at the department store and part-time as a house cleaner just to make ends meet. My back ached constantly, my hands were arthritic from years of physical labor, and I was taking medication for high blood pressure that I couldn't really afford. But when Sarah called needing help with her kids' private school tuition, I found a way to help. When she needed money for a new car, I found a way to help. When she wanted to take the kids to Disney World but couldn't afford it, I found a way to help. Always helping. Always giving. Always saying yes when I should have been saying no. The pattern had become so ingrained that I didn't even recognize it as abnormal anymore. I thought this was what love looked like: constant sacrifice, endless giving, never setting boundaries, or expecting anything in return. That lying in that hospital bed, thinking about the 39-year-old woman who could abandon her injured mother without a second thought, I finally understood the truth. I hadn't been loving Sarah all these years. I'd been enabling her. I'd taught her that love meant taking without giving, that my needs were always secondary to hers, that I existed primarily to solve her problems and fund her lifestyle. And now, when I needed her for the first time in years, really needed her, not just wanted her company, she wasn't there, because I'd never taught her how to be there for anyone but herself. The saddest part was that I'd done it all out of love. Every sacrifice, every loan, every time I'd said yes when I should have said no, I'd done it because I loved her and wanted her to be happy. But in trying to give her everything, I'd given her nothing of value. I'd failed to teach her empathy, reciprocity, or genuine love. I'd created a daughter who saw me as a resource rather than a person, who took my love for granted because it had never come with conditions or boundaries. As I lay there in that hospital bed, I realized that the woman who had hung up on me yesterday wasn't really my daughter anymore. She was a stranger I'd created through years of misguided love, and I had no one to blame but myself. The question now was, what was I going to do about it? I was dozing fitfully when I heard the soft knock on my hospital room door. The afternoon sun was slanting through the blinds, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. I'd been dreaming about Sarah as a little girl again, but this time the memory felt different, tainted somehow by everything I now understood about how our relationship had evolved. "Mrs. Matthews?" Marcus's voice was gentle, respectful. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." I opened my eyes to see him standing in the doorway, holding a small bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums and what looked like a manila folder. He was dressed casually, khakis and a button-down shirt instead of the suit I remembered from our first meeting, but his presence filled the room with a warmth I hadn't felt in days. "Marcus," I said, struggling to sit up straighter. "You came." Of course I came." He approached the bed slowly, as if giving me time to object. "I said I would. How are you feeling?" It was such a simple question, but the way he asked it with genuine concern, waiting for a real answer, made my throat tighten with emotion. When was the last time someone had asked me that and actually wanted to know? "Tired," I said honestly. "Confused." "Hurt." I paused, then added, "Angry, I think. Though I'm not sure I'm allowed to be angry." Marcus set the flowers on my bedside table and pulled the visitor's chair closer to my bed. "Why wouldn't you be allowed to be angry?" The question caught me off guard. I'd spent so many years swallowing my anger, pushing it down, telling myself that good mothers don't get angry at their children. Because she's my daughter. Because I raised her. Because maybe if I'd been a better mother, she wouldn't stop. Marcus's voice was firm but kind. "Mrs. Matthews, may I tell you something I've learned in 20 years of practicing elder law?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Adult children who abandon their parents in hospitals, who refuse to help when their parent is injured and vulnerable. They don't do that because their parent was inadequate. They do it because they've learned that their parent will always be there, no matter how badly they behave. He leaned forward slightly. "You being angry doesn't make you a bad mother. It makes you human." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. How many times had I excused Sarah's behavior, made allowances for her coldness, convinced myself that if I just loved her enough, she'd eventually love me back the way I needed. "I emptied my retirement account for her wedding," I said quietly. $20,000. And she never thanked me. Not once. Marcus's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or sadness. "Tell me about the pattern," he said gently. And so I did. Sitting in that hospital bed, I told this kind stranger about 20 years of financial abuse that I'd disguised as love. About the constant requests for money, the guilt tricks when I hesitated, the way Sarah had learned to frame every demand as an emergency or a safety issue. I told him about the credit cards I'd maxed out, the loans I'd taken, the jobs I'd worked just to fund her lifestyle. About how she only called when she needed something, how she'd disappear for months after I'd helped her, how she'd never once asked if I needed anything in return. "She has 2 children, I said, my voice breaking. "My grandchildren. And she uses them as leverage. When I can't afford something she wants, she hints that maybe I won't be able to see them as much. When I try to set boundaries, she reminds me that they're not really my grandchildren if I'm not willing to help their mother." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Matthews, what you're describing is financial abuse. It's also emotional abuse. The fact that it's coming from your daughter doesn't make it less serious." Financial abuse. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like a language I'd never learned to speak. But I chose to help her. I wanted to help her. And she chose to exploit that love. Marcus opened the folder he'd brought and pulled out a sheet of paper. "This is information about financial abuse of elderly people. It's more common than you might think. And unfortunately, it's often perpetrated by family members." I looked at the paper, seeing words like exploitation, manipulation, and isolation highlighted in yellow. Each word felt like a description of my relationship with Sarah, but seeing them in clinical terms made it somehow more real, more serious. "The isolation is particularly insidious," Marcus continued. "Abusers often work to separate their victims from other sources of support, making them more dependent on the abusive relationship. When was the last time you spent time with friends, Mrs. Matthews?" When was the last time you did something just for yourself? I tried to remember. My friend Margaret from work had retired 5 years ago, and we'd gradually lost touch. My neighbor Mrs. Chun had moved to a retirement community last year. I'd been so focused on Sarah, so available for her crises, that I'd let other relationships fade away. I don't really have friends anymore, I admitted. I work and I help Sarah when she needs it, and that's pretty much my life. That's not a life, Marcus said quietly. That's existing in service to someone else's needs. The truth of it hit me like a wave. I wasn't living my own life. I was living as an extension of Sarah's life, a support system that existed solely to make her world easier. But she's my daughter, I said again, the words feeling weaker each time I said them. I love her. I don't doubt that you love her, Marcus said. But love isn't supposed to be one-sided. Love isn't supposed to drain you financially and emotionally. Love isn't supposed to leave you isolated and afraid. I thought about the phone call yesterday, about the venom in Sarah's voice when she said, I should have been a better mother. I thought about lying in this hospital bed for 2 days, alone and frightened, while my daughter couldn't be bothered to visit. What do I do? I asked, feeling lost and small. Marcus smiled, the first time I'd seen him smile since he'd arrived. You start by understanding that you deserve better. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. You deserve to have. Your needs matter too. He pulled out another paper from his folder. This is a list of resources, support groups, counseling services, legal aid if you decide you need it. But more importantly, it's a reminder that you're not alone in this. I feel alone, I whispered. I know you do. But you're not. There are people who want to help you, not because they want something from you, but because they believe you have value as a person. He paused. I'm one of those people. I looked at this man who barely knew me, who had no obligation to care about my problems, who had shown me more kindness in one afternoon than my own daughter had shown me in years. Why? I asked. Why do you care? Because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, he said simply. Because you called me when you were scared and alone, and I could hear in your voice that you're a good person who's been taken advantage of. Because helping you feels like the right thing to do. The right thing to do. Such a simple concept, but one that had been missing from my relationship with Sarah for so long. When you're ready to go home, Marcus continued, I'll be here to drive you. And if you want help figuring out how to protect yourself going forward, I'll help with that too. Not as your lawyer, as your friend. Friend. The word felt foreign, like a gift I wasn't sure I deserved. I don't know how to have friends anymore, I admitted. I don't know how to have relationships that aren't about giving everything I have. Then, that's where we'll start, Marcus said, with learning that you're worth more than what you can provide for other people. As he gathered his papers and prepared to leave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate. Hope that Sarah would change. But genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, I could change. Maybe I could learn to value myself the way this kind stranger seemed to value me. Marcus, I called as he reached the door. Yes, thank you. For coming, for caring, for helping me understand. He smiled again. Thank you for trusting me with your story. I'll see you tomorrow when you're ready to come home. Home. For the first time in years, the word didn't fill me with dread. Marcus returned the next morning just as the nurse was helping me sit up. The pain was still there, stiff and raw. A reminder that healing was no longer something that happened quickly. That there was also a strange steadiness inside me. A sense that something had shifted. Not enough to make me feel whole. Not yet. But enough to keep me from collapsing under the weight of what I'd lost. He walked in carrying a soft navy jacket, draped over one arm and a tote bag in the other. I wasn't sure if the hospital would give you anything warmer than that paper-thin gown, he said, offering a small smile. This is mine, but I promise it's clean. I laughed, or tried to. The sound came out more like a wheeze, but it startled me. I hadn't expected to laugh again so soon. It's perfect, I said, reaching for it as the nurse helped guide my arm into the sleeve. The discharge process was painfully slow. There were papers to sign, instructions to read, a pharmacist who explained the medication schedule as if I were 5 years old. I nodded through it all, my thoughts drifting again and again to the apartment I hadn't seen in days. I imagined the smell of musty curtains, the stack of unopened mail on the hallway table, the ache of silence that would greet me once the door closed behind us. It wasn't much, but it was mine, or at least it used to be. Marcus walked beside me as they wheeled me out through the automatic doors. The sun was bright, too bright, and I squinted against it as I adjusted to the world again. His car was parked near the entrance, an older sedan with crumbs on the passenger seat, and a church bulletin sticking out of the glove compartment. Somehow, the messengers made me feel more at ease. He helped me in gently, with the kind of attention that made me feel like a person instead of a task. He didn't rush or scold or sigh the way Sarah sometimes had when I moved too slowly. He simply waited, and when I was settled and buckled, he closed the door carefully like I was made of glass. Maybe I was. The ride home was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. I stared out the window, watching familiar streets blur past, and wondered if they would ever feel the same again. Everything looked smaller. Or maybe it was just me shrunken by disappointment, worn thin by grief. When we pulled up to my building, I hesitated. I didn't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready to see the life I'd shrunk myself into for Sarah's sake. Marcus turned off the ignition and waited, giving me space to speak first. This place, I said finally, used to feel like home. He followed my gaze up to the window of my second-floor unit. And now? It feels like ... storage. A holding place. For things no one else wanted. He didn't correct me. Didn't offer platitudes. He just got out of the car, opened my door, and helped me into the wheelchair the hospital had loaned me. The elevator groaned as it climbed, and the hallway smelled like boiled cabbage. Same as it always did. But as we reached my door, a kind of hollowness swept over me. Marcus unlocked the door with the spare key I'd handed him earlier. The moment we entered, I saw the apartment through his eyes. Sparse, clean, but not warm. The sofa was lopsided from years of use, the rug frayed at the corners. Most of the photos on the wall were faded, some curling away from the frames. Edges. There were no fresh flowers, no framed drawings from grandchildren, just empty frames from birthdays gone by, a few old thank you cards gathering dust on the mantel, and the brittle hush of a life pared down to essentials. He helped me to the armchair by the window, the one with the indent from my body shaped. Over time, when I sank into it, I felt something uncoil in me, pain, yes, but also recognition. This was where I'd written every check, taken every pleading phone call, waited for Sarah to visit and counted the days since her last one. Marcus looked around. Do you have someone who helps you here regularly? No, I said quietly. I used to, but I let it go when Sarah said she could stop by more often. She didn't. I heard my voice crack at the end. Hated the way it made me sound needy, weak, but I didn't take it back. He moved into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Do you mind? He called. Go ahead, I replied. A moment later he came back, holding a carton of milk with an expiration date from the previous week. Looks like we'll need to pick up some groceries. I can order online, I lied. The truth was, I hadn't figured out how to work the app. Sarah was supposed to show me months ago, but we'd never gotten around to it. He didn't call me out. Instead, he sat across from me and said, "You don't have to figure everything out today. But you should know you're not alone anymore. If you need help, you can ask. I'll say no if I can't. That's how healthy relationships work." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. I'd spent so long interpreting help as currency, something that bought conditional love. This calm, platonic generosity felt unreal. It filled me with something fragile and unfamiliar. Gratitude without guilt. "Thank you," I whispered, not just for the groceries or the ride or the warmth in his voice, but for the simple fact of staying, for sitting in this faded apartment and not shrinking from the sadness in it. He stood to leave. "I'll check on you tomorrow, if that's all right. And I'll bring that list of support groups we talked about." "That would be nice," I said. "More than nice." After he left, I sat in the silence and let the truth settle in. I was home, but not the same version of myself who had left it days ago. Something had cracked open inside me. I wasn't sure what would grow in the space left behind. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid to find out. It was late afternoon when the knock came, a hard, fast rhythm against the apartment door that immediately set my nerves on edge. I wasn't expecting Marcus. He'd said he'd come by tomorrow, and no one else ever visited unannounced. I eased myself up with the walker the hospital had sent home with me. Every movement a reminder of just how fragile I'd become. The sharp knock came again, louder this time, as if the person on the other side had no patience left in their body. When I opened the door, it was Sarah. She stood there in tight jeans and a fitted blazer, hair pulled back so severely it looked like it hurt. Her lips were pressed into a thin, furious line, and in her hand she held a crumpled sheet of paper, the hospital intake form. I realized the one where I'd listed Marcus as my new emergency contact. "Really, Mom?" she said without even a hello. "Alauya? You made Alauya your emergency contact?" I didn't answer right away. I was too stunned. Not because she was angry. I'd grown used to that. But because she was here. Not at the hospital. Not when I'd needed her. Now, when it was already too late to pretend she cared. She pushed past me into the apartment, her eyes sweeping the living room, like she was evaluating damage. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" she snapped, tossing the paper onto the coffee table. "The hospital called me to confirm it. The nurses were practically whispering, like I'd abandoned you." I closed the door slowly and turned to face her. "You didn't come, Sarah. I was there for 3 days. She whirled around, her eyes flashing. I told them I was busy. "I have responsibilities, Mom. I can't just drop everything every time you decide to climb on a chair and fall." I flinched at her words. I didn't decide to fall. I was trying to get the china down so I could make dinner for you. I wanted to have a night together. To reconnect. Sarah rolled her eyes, folding her arms. "I told you I didn't have time for dinner. You just never listen." The silence between us stretched, heavy with all the words I'd never said. All the times I'd bitten my tongue, swallowed my hurt, told myself she'd come around if I just loved her enough. But I was done shrinking. I was in surgery, Sarah. Alone. No visitors. No flowers. Not even a phone call. You say you were busy, but being busy doesn't mean abandoning someone in a hospital bed. Her expression shifted for a moment, guilt, maybe, or something close. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "So you call Alauya? What is this? Some kind of punishment? You want to embarrass me?" "No," I said, my voice low but steady. "I wanted someone who would answer the phone." She blinked as if slapped. "Don't act like I don't care about you. Do you?" I asked softly. Because when I needed you most, you made it clear that my problems weren't yours to deal with. You made me feel like a burden. Like I was an inconvenience. Sarah crossed the room and stood by the window, arms still folded, her body rigid with defense. You've always been so dramatic. I was lying in a hospital bed, post-surgery, unable to walk. That's not drama. That's reality. She didn't speak for a long moment, just stared out at the parking lot below, jaw tight. This lawyer Marcus, whatever he picked you up, took you home. Are you paying him for this? I laughed short, humorless. No. He offered to help. Not for money. Just because he's kind. Sarah turned slowly to face me. You think this man cares about you? You think he's doing all this out of the goodness of his heart? He's probably just waiting for you to name him in your will. That did it. Something inside me snapped, not anger exactly, but something deeper. A final fraying of the rope I'd clung to for years. The one made of loyalty, guilt, and blind hope. I stood taller, straightening my back despite the pain. You don't get to talk about what people want from me, I said. You've taken money, time, emotional labor. You've taken, and I gave willingly, because I loved you. But now I see what that love became in your hands. Sarah's mouth opened slightly, stunned, but I didn't stop. Marcus didn't ask for anything. He showed up. He listened. He made sure I got home safe and helped me find a way forward. That's more than you've done in years. So this is it? She asked, voice rising. You're cutting me out of your life? For some stranger? No, I said. I'm not cutting you out. I'm stepping out of the cycle. The one where I give and you resent me for it. The one where I beg for your attention and walk on eggshells hoping not to lose you. I'm done. She stared at me, eyes wide, disbelief flickering behind the anger. You're my mother. You're supposed to be there for me. And you're my daughter, I said quietly. You're supposed to care if I'm hurt. The words sat between us like stones. Neither of us moved. Neither of us blinked. Finally, Sarah grabbed her purse from the arm of the couch. Fine, she muttered. If this is the game you want to play, don't come crying to me later. I never cried to you, I said, only for you. The door slammed behind her, rattling the picture frames on the wall. I sank back into my chair, my hands trembling not from weakness, but from the aftershock of finally saying the things I should have said years ago. I stared at the hospital form on the table, Marcus's name printed neatly beside. Emergency. Contact. It wasn't just a practical change, it was a declaration. That I mattered. That my care couldn't be conditional anymore. For the first time in my life, I had chosen to protect myself. And I wasn't sorry. The apartment was still, vibrating with Sarah's fury long after the door slammed shut. I sat frozen in my chair, listening to the clock tick on the wall, like it was counting down to something I couldn't yet name. For a long time, I didn't move, didn't cry, didn't breathe too deeply. I just let the silence wrap around me, tighter and tighter, until I could finally exhale without breaking. I thought I would feel guilt. That old, familiar companion, the one that had followed me from Sarah's childhood into her adult demands, the one that had whispered, "It's your fault. You weren't enough. Try harder." But it didn't come. Not this time. Instead, what I felt was a quiet clarity, sharp, clean, and undeniable. I had told the truth. Not cruelly, not vengefully, just plainly, finally, without apology. 2 days passed without a word from Sarah. I half expected a follow-up phone call. A cold text, maybe even an email titled "Real Your Dramatic Outburst." But nothing came. I imagined her storming around her house, complaining to friends or to her therapist about her ungrateful mother, casting herself as the exhausted victim of some generational injustice. I let her have that version if she needed it. I was done defending myself against ghosts. On the third day, she came back. It was just after noon. I was sipping instant coffee on the couch, a heating pad curled around my hip, the television on but muted. The knock at the door was soft this time, tentative, almost polite. I stared at it for a long second, then slowly rose with the walker and opened it. Sarah stood in the hallway, eyes swollen, face bare. No makeup, no blazer, just a hoodie and jeans and a purse slung over one shoulder, like she wasn't sure if she meant to stay. "Hi," she said, voice hoarse. "Hi," I replied, equally cautious. She shifted her weight awkwardly. "Can I come in?" I nodded and stepped aside. She walked in slowly, looking around the apartment like it had somehow changed since her last visit. I didn't offer her coffee. I didn't fuss or fill the silence. I just sat back down in my chair and waited. "I've been thinking," she said after a while, sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "About what you said. About everything." I said nothing, not because I didn't have thoughts, but because I'd learned that sometimes silence is the only way to see if someone's truly come to talk or just to perform. "I wasn't fair to you," she continued, eyes locked on the floor. "I know that. I've been ... overwhelmed, I guess. Stressed. And I took it out on you. Overwhelmed people don't abandon their mothers in the hospital," I said, not cruelly, just honestly. "They say they're overwhelmed and they ask for help. You didn't ask. You disappeared." She flinched but didn't argue. "I know," she whispered. "And I'm sorry, I really am." She paused, then added, "I've been thinking maybe I could help you out for a while. Just until you're fully recovered. Maybe stay here a couple nights a week. Bring the kids by. You could see them more. We could talk." There it was, the offer wrapped in sweetness, the subtle bait. The emotional reset followed by a hook. And just beneath the surface, the reason. I tilted my head. "That's generous." She looked up, trying to gauge my expression. "School tuition's due soon, isn't it?" I asked softly. Her face didn't change, but her silence confirmed what I already knew. "Sarah," I said gently, "I'm not angry. I'm not trying to punish you. But you need to understand that I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being your fallback plan, your emergency fund, your guilt sponge. That's not what this is," she said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's always what this is," I replied, "and it's my fault for letting it be that way for so long. I raised you to think my love was the same thing as sacrifice. But it's not." She looked at me, eyes flashing with something close to panic. "So what, you're cutting me off? You're just done with me?" "No," I said. "I'm done with the part of our relationship where love is one-sided. I'm done enabling a pattern that hurts us both." Her mouth opened, then closed. She stood up abruptly and walked to the window, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You don't get it," she said finally. "My life is hard, Mom. You think it's just vacations and tuition and selfish demands, but it's not. I'm doing this all alone. Michael barely pays child support. The kids are acting out. I'm drowning." I listened, not unsympathetically. I believed her. I always had. "I know you're struggling," I said, "but you don't get to treat me like a lifeline you only reach for when your hands are burning. You don't get to show up when you want something and vanish the rest of the time." "I don't know how to be different," she said, voice cracking. "Then learn," I said gently. like I'm learning. We both made mistakes. But if you want something real between us, something honest, you're going to have to meet me halfway. She turned around, and for a moment I saw the girl she used to be. Confused. Wanting something she couldn't quite name. And if I don't? She asked quietly. Then I'll grieve and I'll go on. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She picked up her purse and walked to the door. I'll think about it, she said. I don't know what else to say. Then that's enough for now. She left more quietly than she had before. And this time, there was no slam. I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, the silence soft instead of punishing. For the first time, I'd seen Sarah waver. Not change, but waver. And I had not wavered in return. Maybe the pattern hadn't. Shattered completely. But it had cracked. And I was no longer the one patching it back together. The days that followed Sarah's visit passed quietly. But they weren't empty. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a call or holding my breath after a tense conversation. I wasn't pacing the living room rehearsing apologies I hadn't earned the right to make. Instead, I found myself waking each morning with a strange, unfamiliar feeling I could only describe as space to think, to breathe, to exist without guilt. Clawing at my chest. Marcus came by, as promised. He carried 2 tote bags, one with groceries and another filled with folders, pamphlets, and handwritten notes. He insisted I sit while he unpacked the food, and I listened to the comforting shuffle of pantry items landing softly on my worn kitchen shelves. It had been a long time since someone thought to ask if I had food in the house, without me having to explain or justify the need. I found a few things that might interest you, he said once he returned to the living room and sat across from Emmy. He opened the folder and handed me a simple flyer printed on pale blue paper. Support group for seniors experiencing family estrangement. Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Community Center Room 204. I studied the page, unsure of how to respond. The words on the flyer: estrangement, isolation, grief beyond death, were ones I'd used in my head but never said aloud. Do people really go to these? I asked quietly. They do, Marcus said. And they don't all walk in ready to talk. Some just sit and listen, but they show up. And sometimes that's enough. I nodded, folding the flyer in half and setting it on the coffee table. I don't know if I'm ready. You don't have to be, he said. You just have to want something different than what you've had. Later that night, I stared at the folded flyer beside my teacup until the words blurred. I wasn't sure if I had the strength to walk into a room full of strangers and say, my daughter treats me like I'm disposable. But I was sure I didn't want to feel like this alone. Uncertain. Suspended in limbo forever. The following Wednesday, I went. Marcus had offered to drive me, but I told him I needed to do this part alone. He understood, gave me a ride to the community center and waited outside in the parking lot, reading a book under the streetlight while I sat in room 204 with a group of older men and women who, like me, were learning how to grieve people who were still alive. I didn't speak. That first night, I barely made eye contact. But I listened. I listened to a man named Bill talk about his son who hadn't called in 5 years. To a woman named Joyce who said her daughter had stopped bringing the grandkids around after a disagreement over boundaries. I listened to the quiet, choked words of a retired teacher who said she used to write her birthday on her calendar in ink, but now left the day blank. They weren't bitter. That surprised me. They weren't wallowing in self-pity or lashing out at their children. They were sad. Yes, but they were also brave. They were trying to build something out of the wreckage. I left that night with the flyer still in my pocket, but also with something else. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Solidarity. Marcus clapped softly when I came out. He didn't ask questions, just smiled and handed me a paper bag from the bakery around the corner. Cinnamon rolls, he said, because that first meeting is always the hardest. We developed a rhythm after that. He would check in with a call or a visit, never overstepping, never hovering, just showing up when he said he would, helping me feel seen without feeling controlled. It wasn't the kind of relationship I was used to, but that's what made it feel precious. It was light where my history had been heavy. I also began volunteering. It started small, just reading to adults at the library's literacy center once a week. But it awakened something in me. I'd forgotten how much I loved language. The way stories could build bridges between strangers. Sitting beside a middle-aged woman who had never finished high school, helping her sound out a sentence about a garden blooming in spring, I felt useful again. Not exploited, not obligated, just deeded in the right way. One afternoon, Marcus dropped off a stack of large print books he'd borrowed from the library. "You said you liked old mysteries," he reminded me, placing them on the coffee table like they were treasures. "I did," I said, smiling. "And I still do." We talked that day, not about Sarah, not directly, but about change, about what it meant to grow older in a world that often preferred to ignore us. I told him I sometimes felt like a photograph someone had tucked into a drawer, faded and curling at the edges, remembered only when convenient. "You're not a photograph," he said gently. "You're the frame. You held everything together. For years. Now you get to decide what you want to hold on to." His words stayed with me. I repeated them to myself the next time I set a firm boundary, the next time I said no to something that would have cost me more than I could afford emotionally. Therapy came next, another gentle nudge from Marcus, who handed me a list of counselors who specialized in elder emotional care. I chose one after 2 weeks of staring at the list and finally called. Her name was Dr. Latham, and she spoke softly but without pity. During our sessions, I told her things I hadn't even admitted to myself. How ashamed I'd felt all these years for never being enough. How afraid I was of dying and being remembered only for how much I'd given, not for who I was. "You deserve to be known," she told me once. Not just used, not just tolerated, known. And slowly I began to believe her. By early spring, I found myself cooking again, not out of obligation, but for pleasure. I planted herbs in little pots on my kitchen windowsill. I joined a book club at the community center. I began to send holiday cards to people in the support group, not because I expected anything in return, but because I wanted them to know they were remembered. I was still 72, still healing, still walking with a cane. But I was no longer bracing myself for Sarah's next demand. I was no longer trying to earn love by erasing myself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to live. It happened on a Tuesday. I had just returned from the library, a tote bag of large print novels slung over my shoulder and a small bunch of fresh rosemary tucked into my coat pocket. The wind had picked up, stirring the smell of rain and old pavement, and I'd felt something close to peace walking home. My hips still ached, of course, but I'd learned to move slowly, deliberately, like someone who respected her own limits. I was unlocking the front door when I saw her. Sarah, leaning against the railing of the apartment walkway, arms folded across her chest. She wasn't wearing makeup this time, and the sharp, composed edges I'd come to expect were gone. Her eyes were red, her skin pale beneath the overhead light, and she looked for the first time in a long while unsteady. My heart clenched, but I didn't let it soften me. "Not right away, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice even. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she murmured, pushing off the railing. "Can we talk?" I opened the door and let her in, setting my books down with more care than necessary. I didn't ask if she wanted tea. I didn't fuss or fill the silence with apologies. She sat down without being asked, curling into the corner of the couch like she used to when she was a teenager and had stayed out too late. "I'm being evicted," she said finally. "They raised the rent again, and her voice cracked. "I just don't have it. I maxed out my cards trying to keep up with tuition and groceries and everything else. I went to Dad, but he said it's not his problem." I said nothing. Not yet. She looked at me with pleading eyes. "Mom, I need help." There it was, the moment I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head. The moment when everything would hinge on how I responded. I remembered how many times she had needed help before. How many times I'd rearranged my life, depleted my savings, sacrificed my health. And how many times I had done it hoping it would finally be enough to earn her love. But this time, I wasn't confused about what was being asked, and I wasn't confused about who I was anymore. "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I know it's hard, I really do." She blinked, unsure. "That wasn't a yes." "I've been trying," she said quickly. "Working extra hours, selling stuff online. I've even picked up some freelance gigs. I'm not just asking for a handout. You're asking for my home," I said gently. "You're asking me to step back into a pattern that nearly destroyed me." She stood up, agitation blooming behind her eyes. "So that's it? You're cutting me off? After everything I've done for you?" My mouth fell open for a second before I recovered. "Everything you've done for me. I came by last month, didn't I? I said I was sorry. I offered to help. I tried. You came when you thought I might still be useful," I replied. "You offered to help on the condition that I would help you. That's not love, Sarah. That's a transaction." She crossed her arms, her voice rising. "You want me to beg? Fine. I'm begging. If I don't get help soon, the kids and I are going to have nowhere to go. I'm your daughter, Mom. Don't you care about that?" I stood slowly, gripping the back of the chair for support. "I do care. That hasn't changed. But love doesn't mean allowing myself to be destroyed. It doesn't mean handing over the roof above my head because you didn't plan for your responsibilities. I won't let guilt drive me anymore. Not even for you." Her expression twisted. "So you'd let your grandkids end up in a shelter?" "No," I said. "I'd help you find community resources. I'd help you fill out paperwork, call organizations, explore every option available to you. But I will not sacrifice the small stability I've built just to be used again." She stared at me, mouth pressed into a line. Then, without warning, her voice turned cold. "Then don't expect to see them again. If you can't help me when I need it most, you don't get to play grandma when it's convenient." The words were a dagger, that they didn't find the same soft, desperate target they once would have. I looked at her, truly looked, and saw not a daughter offering love, but a woman weaponizing blood. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said. "But I won't be blackmailed, Sarah. Not anymore." She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand. "I spent decades confusing sacrifice for love. I gave you everything I had and more. And I never asked for anything in return. I just hoped naively that one day you'd care. But I see now that my love didn't teach you to care. It taught you to take." She looked stunned. "I'll always be your mother," I said. "And I'll always love you. But I won't destroy myself to earn a love you aren't ready to give. When you're willing to have a relationship based on honesty, not leverage, I'll be here." There was silence. Then she grabbed her purse, muttering something under her breath I couldn't hear. She moved toward the door and opened it halfway, before pausing. "You think this makes you strong," she said bitterly. "But all it makes you is alone." I didn't flinch. I was never lonelier than when I was begging you to love me while calling it helping you. She walked out without another word. When the door closed behind her, the apartment was quiet again. Not heavy this time. Not cold, just quiet. I sat back down in my chair, exhaling deeply. My hand trembled, but not with fear, with release. The final confrontation had come, and I had chosen myself. For the first time, I had protected the life I was finally learning to build. The letter came in a plain white envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable Sarah's, slightly rushed and uneven, as if she'd written it while second-guessing herself. Stared at it for a long time before opening it, unsure whether it would contain a final apology or another veiled demand. After everything, I knew better than to expect either. Inside was a birthday card. Simple, store-bought. On the front, a watercolor image of a single candle glowing atop a cupcake. No personal message, just "Love, Sarah" scrawled beneath the pre-printed greeting. No mention of what had passed between us. No acknowledgement of what had been broken. But for once, I didn't feel gutted by the emptiness. I set the card on the table without bitterness, then turned back to the window where sunlight streamed through the curtain and lit up the rim of my tea mug. Outside, children were playing. Near the sidewalk, someone's grandchildren, maybe. A woman from the building across the way watered her balcony herbs. The world moved on. And so did I. It had been nearly a year since my fall, since that cold awakening in a hospital bed when I first understood that love, without respect or reciprocity, was not love at all. In that time, I had not heard Sarah say the words I once ached to hear. But I had stopped needing them. I no longer woke each morning hoping for reconciliation. I had stopped making excuses for her absence. I had stopped asking what I had done wrong, because I knew now I had done the best I could. And that mattered. On my kitchen wall, just above the calendar, was a neatly taped list titled Emergency Contacts. It was handwritten in dark ink with a magnet shaped like a teacup pinning it in place. The first name on the list was Marcus Chun. Friend, advocate, witness. Not because I'd paid him or earned his favor through obligation, but because he had seen me, truly seen me in one of my lowest moments and offered me dignity instead of pity. Since that day, Marcus had become more than a lifeline. He was part of my community now. Someone who showed up with a bag of oranges after my blood pressure scare, who sat with me through long afternoons when I didn't feel like talking, who celebrated my smallest victories without expecting anything. In return, next on the list was Joyce, a fellow member of the Wednesday support group. She'd brought me soup when I caught the flu and called me every Sunday morning without fail. Then Bill, who drove me to therapy appointments and always brought a thermos of strong coffee. And finally, the name of my literacy student, Monica, who had just passed her high school equivalency exam at 54 and insisted I come to her. Celebration potluck. None of these people shared my blood. But they showed up. They remembered. They saw me as more than a resource to be tapped when convenient. They valued me because I existed, not because I provided. That, I had learned, was the difference between family by blood and family by choice. Glanced over at the stack of books by the armchair. The half-knitted shawl in progress draped across the basket beside it. The framed quote on my wall that said, "Still, I rise." I had once thought it was too bold, too proud for someone like me. Now I saw it as truth. Not defiance, but survival. Every week I still went to the support group. Not because I needed to vent, but because I wanted to listen. I had become one of the ones who nodded gently when new members struggled to speak. I knew the way shame clung to your skin when a child you'd raised turned cold. I knew the quiet terror of admitting you were no longer loved in the way you once believed was unconditional. But I also knew what came after that. Life did not end when love changed its shape. Life did not collapse when a daughter no longer saw you as her home. If anything, it began again slowly, quietly, like the first crocus pushing through frozen ground in therapy. I had learned to say I deserve without flinching. I deserve respect. I deserve boundaries. I deserve to be more than useful. I deserve to be seen. That knowledge did not erase the grief. I still missed the little girl who once climbed into bed with me during thunderstorms. I still remembered the smell of strawberry shampoo and the way she used to whisper, "I love you more than the whole world." That child had existed. I had loved her with every part of myself. But I no longer chased ghosts. I gave that love freely. It had not been wasted. It had been real. And it had been enough. Now, when I looked at Sarah's name on old documents or past her photo in the album I kept in the hallway closet, I didn't feel rage or despair. I felt distance and peace. I could miss her without longing. I could remember her without crumbling. I looked again at the emergency contact list and felt a quiet pride. Each name had become a small monument to the life I had chosen to rebuild. I no longer lived in fear of being discarded. I no longer tolerated silence packaged as love. The phone rang a soft chime. I answered. It was Marcus. "Still planning to come by the community center tonight?" he asked. "Of course," I said, smiling. "I've got cookies cooling now." "Can't." "Wait," he said. "Oh, and Monica wants to know if you'll help her write her speech." I'd be honored. We hung up, and I looked around my modest apartment, once a shell of sacrifice. Now it was full of small sacred things, herbs on the sill, a print from the library book sale, mismatched mugs from neighbors who'd come and stayed. I picked up the folded birthday card from Sarah, held it for a moment, and then slipped it into a drawer, not out of bitterness, but because I had somewhere else to be. As I left the apartment, cane in hand, tote bag on my shoulder, I paused for just a second at the door. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living.